minutes. Well, one cold winter, when Hatho, the spirit of winter, had frozen the ponds and covered the trees and the ground with a race of snow, Bear was walking along and he saw Fox. Decided to say to Fox for the 23rd time that morning how beautiful his tail was. And he came up to Fox and he went, Fox, look at my tail. I brushed it out with a pine cone. Now, how many of you love to listen to braggarts, people bragging? How many don't like to listen to people bragging? Yeah. I've got to tell you, Fox had it 23 times before 9 o'clock in the morning. And so Fox went, that's a wonderful tail, really a beautiful tail. I got to run though, Bear. But Fox decided Bear needed to learn a lesson about bragging. So he went on down the path, knowing that eventually Bear would go down that path. And he went to a pond about as big as this room that was frozen solid. And Fox, he went out in the middle of that pond and with his sharp claws, he dug a hole in the ice. He put his back to that hole, he took his red tail, put it in the water, and he began to wait. What was he doing? Fishing. Fox was fishing. How many have ever gone ice fishing before? Okay, I'm going to have a question for you in a minute. Well, after a couple minutes, a fish bit his tail, he pulled the fish out of the water and slapped it on the ice. And this way, within a couple hours, Fox had a pile of fish surrounding him and his tail was back in the water as Bear came walking down the path. And Bear came up the path and he saw Fox out in the middle of the pond surrounded by fish, and Bear went, "Oh, I love fish." And he looked over at Fox as Fox pulled a fish out of the water, slapped it on the ice, and pulled it off his tail. And Bear went, Fox, what are you doing? Fox looked at Bear, looked at the fish, and said, "I'm fishing, Bear." Bear went, "Oh, I like fish. Can I have some of your fish?" And Fox said, "Oh, no, Bear, I'm sorry. I just have enough fish for my family for dinner." And Bear, he got sad for a minute, and then something happened that rarely happened to Bear. He had an idea. He went, "I know. Fox, can I go fishing?" And Fox said, "What a good idea, Bear. Of course you can. Here, but I'll bring you on the, and find a place for you to fish." And Bear started walking towards Fox's fishing hole. And Fox went, "No, Bear. Well, you can't fish in this fishing hole. I've already taken all the fish out of this fishing hole. We'll have to find you your own special fishing hole. Come with me." And he brought him right to the edge of the pond, right near shore. And with his sharp claws, he dug a hole in the ice, and he said, "There you go, Bear, your own fishing hole." And Bear, he went, "Oh, good. What do I do?" And Fox said, "Oh, it's easy, Bear. It's easy. All you have to do is sit down with your back to the hole, put your long, beautiful tail in the water, and then wait for a fish to bite." And Bear, he went, "Good. How will I know when a fish is biting my tail?" And Fox said, "Oh, good point. I'll tell you what. I'll go hide behind those pine trees, and when a fish bites your tail, I'll yell, 'Now, Bear!' and you pull your tail out of the water with that fish on it and slap it on the ice and pull it off your tail, and you got dinner." And Bear, he went, "Oh, good. But I gotta ask, now how many of you have gone ice fishing before? Okay, you can just yell it out. How many fish are you gonna find right near shore? None. Fox knew this. Bear didn't. And so, Bear sat down at his fishing hole, and Fox said, oh, by the way, Bear, one more thing. Fish can hear your thoughts. So you have to empty your mind of all thoughts, Bear. The bear went, I think I can do that. And so Bear sat down, he put his long, glossy black tail in the water. He sat there and he emptied his mind of all thoughts. It took about 2 seconds. Meanwhile, Fox had gone over behind the pine trees. He had strung his fish and put him over his shoulder. And once he got behind the pine trees, he went, ha, 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 ha. That'll teach Bear a lesson. Foolish Bear. He's not going to catch any fish there. And Fox walked on home. He went to his long house where his wife and his children were waiting. He cooked up the fish. Well, he cleaned them first. He cooked up the fish. They had a wonderful dinner, and after dinner he played with his children. Meanwhile, Bear was sitting there with his tail in that water, and he was sitting there waiting, and waiting, and waiting. His mind empty of all thoughts. Well, after playing with the children, Fox and his wife and his children, they lay down to go to sleep. And kids, in the middle of the night, a terrible storm came up. 8 inches of snow fell to the earth, and the temperature dropped to 10 degrees below zero. Well, I've got to tell you, in the middle of the night, Fox had to get up and throw another blanket over his children. And in the morning when he woke up, it was so cold he put on his heavy red coat. And then he went, I wonder if there's any of that fish from yesterday. And he went, how many of you like leftovers? I love leftovers. And I think a lot of adults find that leftovers taste better than the first day. Well, he found the leftovers and he was eating them. And as he did, he went, I wonder how long Bear stayed at that pond. I wonder if Bear is still there. Nah, Bear wouldn't be there still, would he? And then he realized he just might be. So he left his longhouse. He took the path towards the pond. And as he got near the pond, Fox heard this weird sound. He heard this. And he went, what's that noise? It was making the trees shake. And then finally he came to that pond, and there, on the far side of the pond, was a small hill of snow. And that hill of snow was snoring. Bear had fallen sound asleep. Fox burst out laughing. He went, ha, ha, poor Bear. He fell asleep. Shh, I'll go wake him up. And so Fox tiptoed across the ice. He got to that hill of snow, kind of figured out where Bear's ear might be, and he yelled, "No, Bear!" And Bear leapt up with snow flying everywhere. He was confused for a minute. He went, where am I? Fish. I'm fishing. And then Bear, with a great pull, swang, pulled his tail out of the water. Well, he thought he pulled his tail out of the water. I did say it got cold the night before, right? How cold? 10 degrees below zero. It got so cold that all the water around Bear's tail froze solid. And when Bear had pulled on his tail, whang! He didn't pull out a perch or a trout. He pulled his own tail clean off. And Bear, he went, No, I hope it's a trout. I love trout. My tail! My beautiful tail! And Bear's tail was frozen in the ice, just blowing back and forth in the breeze. Bear was so upset he just kept going, my tail! My tail! Now Fox was laughing so hard, tears were going down his cheeks. And his sides hurt. You ever laugh that hard? Yeah. He's going, oh, you pulled your own tail off. And Bear, he went, Fox, I'm gonna get you. And he jumped toward Fox, but Fox jumped up and went running across the ice. Bear chased him across the ice, chased him down the hillside, chased him through the forest, down a valley, up over a mountain, down another valley, chased him all day long until the sun went down. And Fox got away. Because foxes are faster than bears. But Bear had chased him all day long, and Bear was so tired that when he got back to his cave, he fell deep asleep and did not wake up until the warm breath of spring was in the air. Ever since that day, bears do what we call hibernating. They sleep all winter long. Ever since that day, all bears have these stubby little tails instead of those long, glossy black tails. And ever since that day, bears have no love for foxes. And that's a story called How Bear Lost His Tail. Tricky to remember. Thank you very much. Thank you. By the way, one of the reasons I do this kind of applause is from up here it looks really cool with everybody doing that. Kind of like a giant sea anemone. Now I'm going to tell you a scary story. And I will. And unfortunately, we're going to be in the winter time again. That's okay. And here's how it goes. The story is called The Vampire Skeleton. Many, many years ago, actually just south of Honeyhoy Falls, there was a village, a Seneca village, and in that village there was a man that everybody was afraid of. They said he was evil. They said he was a sorcerer and he could do terrible dark magic. It was rumored that he could turn into a large black owl and would go flying out at night doing terrible things. Whatever the truth was, when he died, nobody felt too bad about it. And as was the custom with the Seneca, they put his body in a cedar box, and they took that cedar box deep into the forest to a sort of hidden place where he had his longhouse. And they put that cedar box in the back of the longhouse, went back to their village, and began to forget about that evil, evil man. Many seasons went by. The moon rose and went down. The sun came up and went down. The years rolled up until there were only 2 or 3 people in that village that even remembered that terrible, evil sorcerer. Well, one cold day in December, when snow covered the ground and covered the trees and the ponds were frozen, a man and a woman from another village were going to that first village. And the woman, she walked along carrying a bundle of supplies for her sister's crops had failed. She was bringing spare food to her sister, surplus. And she carried a bundle of supplies in front of her and the baby in the cradle board behind her. Her husband walked along next to her carrying his war club in his hand and complaining bitterly. He said, "Wife, the sun has gone down. When will we get to my sister, your sister's house. And she said, have patience, husband. I know it's not much further. We will be there soon. And the husband said, well, I don't like it. It's dark, and I'm cold, and I don't like walking in the snow. And the wife said, be patient, husband. We will be there soon. But he just kept complaining about the wind, about everything. And as they walked through the pine forest, Grandmother Moon rose above the trees. It was a full moon, like the full moon last weekend. Did any of you see that moon? It was bright, wasn't it? It was a bright moon like that one. And it shone down and showed their path as they walked along. And they came into a large clearing in the middle of the forest. And at the far edge of that clearing was an old longhouse. The elm bark covering on it was ragged and had many holes in it, but the poles and the structure was still strong. And the husband, he stopped. He looked at that place and he said, wife, do you see that deserted longhouse? And his wife looked at it, and when she did, she got a knot in her belly, and a chill ran up her spine. Has that ever happened to you? And she got a bad feeling about it. And she went, yes, husband. He said, wife, we're going to stay here tonight. And the wife immediately said, husband, no, when I look at this place, I get a bad feeling in my belly. There's something evil here. Let's just keep going. We'll be fine. And the husband said, wife, I'm tired. We're staying here tonight. And the wife just shook her head and said, yes, husband. And so they walked towards that lodge, and the husband lifted the ragged deerskin door flap, and the wife went inside with a bundle of supplies and the baby. And as she did, the baby began to cry and fret. And as the husband came in and dropped the door flap, he said, wife, quiet that baby down. How will I ever sleep? And the wife just shook her head and said, yes, husband. And they looked around the inside of the lodge. Off to the left side of the lodge, there was a rough-made bed of pine boughs, pine branches. And way in the back of the lodge was an old cedar box, discolored with time. And the man looked around and he said, wife, you see this bed over here of pine branches? I will sleep there tonight. Better to protect you in case something happens. And the wife just shook her head and said, yes, husband. And the man walked over to that rough-made bed. He took out his 2 blankets, wrapped them around himself, and he lay down and was soon fast asleep. The woman, she looked around the lodge, trying to find a good spot for herself and her baby. And she found a fairly smooth spot, not too far from the door. She took off the bundle of supplies and put them on the ground. She took the baby and the cradle board off of her back. She pulled out her 1 blanket, wrapped it around the baby, and then laid down next to the bundle of supplies, encircling the baby with her arms for warmth. In this way, that woman fell sound asleep. Suddenly, she woke up with a start. She had heard a loud sound, a sort of a cracking sound. The kind of sound a mouse's bones will make when an owl bites down on it. And she looked around in the darkness and she said, husband, did you hear that sound? But her husband didn't respond. She said, husband, did you hear that noise? But still, the husband was silent, thinking that he was just sleeping deeply. She was about to call out louder, and then she heard her baby softly breathing. Well, she didn't want to wake up the child. So she got up in a crouch and she moved towards her husband. And she shook his foot and said, "Husband, husband, did you hear that noise?" Still, he said nothing. So she got even closer to where she could see his face in the moonlight shining through the holes in the elm bark. And she shook his shoulder and went, "Husband, husband, did you hear that?" Ah! She couldn't believe what she was seeing. For her husband lay there on those pine boughs, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, and blood all over his throat. She looked at him and said, "Husband, husband, what has happened here? What is going on? And then she noticed in the back of the lodge that the cover of the cedar box now lay on the ground in front of the box. So still in a crouch, she went closer to the box to look inside. And as she got close, she went, "Oh!" She couldn't believe what she was seeing. In the box was a tall skeleton of a man with wisps of white hair coming off the skull and blood covering its mouth. And she said to herself, It is Iroquois, one of the ones that comes back from the dead to prey upon the living. I've heard such stories about these creatures." "Oh no." And she looked back at her baby. She said, he will come for my child soon. I must protect my baby." And so, quietly, still in a crouch, she went back to where the baby lay sleeping. She lay down next to the baby, encircling it with her arms and pulling it close. And for a moment, she pretended to sleep. But she only pretended to sleep. In a little bit, holding the baby close, she got up again into a crouch, and she began to move towards the door of the lodge, step by step, the way a heron moves when it's walking through the water stalking a fish. And as she got near the door flap of the lodge, she heard something in the back of the lodge, and when she looked back at that cedar box, the skeleton sat up and turned towards her. She found herself staring into a pair of bright red eyes, like embers burning in a fire. And she wanted to run. She was so frightened. But it was as if she was frozen. She couldn't move. And even as the skeleton stood up out of the box, extended its bony arms, and began to walk towards her, she couldn't move. It was as if she was hypnotized. And as she stared into those red burning eyes, as it got closer and closer and closer, the skeleton let out an animal-like growl, and the sound seemed to wake the woman as if from a dream. And she ran through the door flap and ran across the clearing like a deer being chased by a wolf. But she could hear behind her the crunching of its bony feet in the snow as it chased her. As she ran across the clearing, she looked behind her. It was only 20 feet away. And she ran faster than she'd ever run in her life. She ran down the hill. At the bottom of the hill, she almost stumbled, but righted herself on a maple tree. And she looked over her shoulder. It was now just 15 feet away. With every step of its bony feet, it was getting closer and closer. She kept running and running through the forest, leaping over branches, trying not to fall, because she knew if she fell, her baby and her would be gone. And she prayed to the Great Spirit as she ran, and she looked over her shoulder. The skeleton was now 10 feet. And she ran through the forest. Her heart was drumming so loud in her chest that she could hear it in her ears. And again she prayed to the Great Spirit, not to save her, to save her child. And she looked over her shoulder. It was 5 feet. She ran harder than she'd ever run in her life, but she stumbled for a moment over a rock and then righted herself, and she looked behind her. The skeleton was right behind her. Its bony arms were raised, and its hands were about to come down on her shoulders and pull her down. And even as its bony fingers came towards her shoulders, from some deep, holy place inside of her heart, she found more strength and began to run even faster. But she knew the skeleton was right behind her. She knew that if she stumbled or slipped or slowed, that it would have her and her baby. And as she ran, she said, "Please, please, great Creator, help us." And just then, she saw the white circle and cross on a tree, the mark of a village nearby. And she came out of the forest into a large clearing with many longhouses. And she saw light coming from the entryway of one of the longhouses. She ran to it and burst in on a group of men sitting around the central fire. And she cried out, "Help me, help me, there's a monster, Iroquois is trying to kill me." And she collapsed on the ground. The men jumped up, grabbing their war clubs and their bows and arrows, and they went out into that pre-dawn light. And there, at the edge of the dark forest, they saw the tall skeleton of a man with wisps of white hair coming off its skull, and 2 red eyes like burning embers in a fire. And as they looked at that creature, it let out an animal-like snarl and turned and disappeared into the dark forest. By now, the whole village had awoken. They had gathered around that woman. They had comforted her, given her water to drink. And her sister had showed up and was taking care of her baby. And they asked her what had happened, and she told the story of finding that lodge in the forest, of what had happened to her husband. And as she spoke, an old woman stepped forward and went, "Ah, yes, I remember that one. He was evil, and I know what we must do to end his evil. Meet me at the edge of the village when the sun is 2 hands width above the horizon." Later in the morning, when the sun was 2 hands width above the horizon, the way the Haudenosaunee used to tell time, a war party met at the edge of the village. And led by the old woman and the younger woman, they followed the trail that had been made in the snow the night before, deep into the forest. By the way, she left her baby with her sister. And the war party followed that trail, and eventually they came to that secret place where that being's lodge was. And the old woman said, "Okay, everyone gather up dry wood and stack it around the outside of the lodge. We must burn out this evil. There is something I must do." And with that, the old woman stepped forward, lifted the ragged deerskin door flap, and went into the lodge. How many of you would do that? Yeah. Not me. Well, she walked into that lodge, and she went right to the back of the lodge where she saw an old discolored cedar box. And she lifted the lid off of the cedar box. Inside, she saw Iroquois, the tall skeleton of a man with wisps of white hair coming off the skull, covered from head to toe in blood. The other woman's husband, he was now nothing but bones. And the old woman, she took a deerskin bag from her side, she opened it up, and she took out some herbs that have binding power. And she sprinkled those herbs over the body. And then from her other side, she took a rattle made out of a turtle shell. You've seen ones like that, haven't you? And she shook that turtle shell over the body, that rattle over the body 7 times as she chanted a word of power. Then she turned around and walked back out of the lodge. And the villagers, they had gathered dry wood from the forest surrounding them and stacked it all around the outside of the lodge.
And the old woman said, now everybody, make a circle around the lodge and hold hands. Do not let go. And the old woman walked forward with a piece of flint and some tinder, and she hit the flint on a stone until it sparked and caught the tinder on fire. And soon, a circle of flames was glowing around that lodge. But that lodge was so old, it was so dry that those flames licked up the sides of that lodge and were soon leaping towards the treetops. The men in that circle holding hands, they tried to get back as far as they could. It was burning like an inferno. And as they watched that lodge burn, they heard something inside get up and begin to scream like a trapped animal, running back and forth, and then the lodge walls just collapsed inwards. And a huge cloud of smoke came billowing out, and out of that smoke came a large black owl flying. And it flew right toward the circle of men. And forgetting what the old woman had said, they dropped their hands, they grabbed their war clubs, and they tried to knock it out of the air. But that black owl flew over their heads and off into the forest. They all looked to the old woman, and she said, it's all right. Everything will be fine. He cannot live in that form very long. He will be dead soon. We have done good work tonight. And with that, the villagers all turned around and they went back to their village. That woman, she stayed with her sister, decided to stay in that village, and 2 years later, she met another man and she married that man. But this new husband, why, he was like night is to day from the first husband. For when his wife said that she had a feeling about something, he listened to her and heeded her advice. And from that day on, the Senecas no longer left bodies in cedar boxes on the surface of the ground. From that day forward, the Senecas buried those boxes deep in the earth so that the dead could never again come back to haunt the living. And that's the story of the family. Can I ask the teacher something? We've got time for one more, yes? Okay, great. I always believe that it's not right to leave people with a scary story. I always believe you got to tell them a funny story afterwards. So, now here it is. Well, actually, I know one that. So, how many of you want a funny story? How many of you want a kind of scary story? I'll tell you what, I'll tell you a funny kind of scary story. This is called The Brave Woman, and it's very similar. You'll see the similarity in the tales, but that happens a lot in folklore. This is called The Brave Woman and the Flying Head. Well, now let me explain that. The Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, they were always bothered by all sorts of monsters. There were stone giants. There were mosquitoes as big as a pickup truck. And worst of all, there were flying heads. Now, a flying head is, well, it's about as tall as a man, but it's just a head. It has long, straggly hair. It has two kind of like bear-like arms and claws, and so it can grab food and put it in its big mouth. And flying heads, they're not vegetarians. They're not meat eaters. They're omnivores. They will eat anything that's edible, and they love to eat people. Well, one day this woman was going from her village to her sister's village. Sound familiar? Carrying a bundle of supplies. The three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, because her sister's crops had failed and she had extra, and she carried her baby in a cradle board behind her. By the way, I rarely tell these two stories next to each other. And she had left her village right at dawn, and she was about, a little past noon, and she had stopped at the bottom of the hill to rest for a moment. Whew. And as she was resting, she heard a sound like a tornado coming through the forest. And then up over a hill came the flying head. And the flying head, it stopped at the top of the hill. And by the way, flying heads, they smell really well. They have great senses of smell, better than dogs. And the flying head stopped at the top of the hill, and it went, "Roar, roar, roar." And it saw that woman with the baby down at the bottom of the hill at the edge of the forest, and it went, "Roar," and it started flying down the hill towards that woman, and she went, "Oh no, what can I do?" And then she remembered. Flying heads love to eat, and flying heads will not leave any food behind. She took off that bundle of supplies, she ripped it open, and she threw the corn and the squash and the beans all over the place. And then she went running off into the forest with her baby in the cradle board behind her. She ran and ran and ran, and the flying head was coming down that hill towards where she was, going, "Ah! Ah!" It was coming down like a hurricane. And as it came to all that food on the ground, it went, "Rah, rah, rah." And it just started eating all that food. And the woman, she ran and ran and ran until she couldn't run anymore. And she listened. She couldn't hear the flying head. She'd gotten away. And the flying head, it was back there eating every piece of corn, every bit of squash, going, until it looked around and there was only one more bean on the ground. And it went, and then it went, and it knew right where that woman had gone. Its sense of smell told her. And so it began to go through the forest after that woman and her baby, going, "Rah!" Like a tornado. Grass and trees were whipped up in the air, spinning around. And as the woman was walking along, all of a sudden she heard crashing behind her, and the flying head came out of the forest. And she didn't know what to do for a second. And then she remembered a story she had learned as a child, that babies' moccasins have magic power. And so as the flying head was coming towards her, she took off the baby's moccasins and threw them on the ground. And the moccasins, by magic, created brambles and briar bushes that sprung up 30 feet into the air. And as the flying head was coming towards that woman, it went through those brambles and briars, and its long hair got tangled. And it went, and the woman, she ran and ran and ran and ran and ran as it tried to untangle itself. And she ran until she came into a clearing. She knew that she could not outrun a flying head. But there in the middle of the clearing was a white pine tree. And so she went to the white pine tree, and she climbed up and up and up, way up into the pine tree. And she held on for dear life, and she looked at her baby over her shoulder, and she said, "My child, please, shh, don't make a sound." And the flying head, it was angry now. That being, that woman had gotten her tangled, and it had ripped big clumps of hair out of its head. But finally it went, and
and it saw what direction that woman had gone, and it started flying through the forest like a cyclone. Rocks and sticks just spinning off into space as it went by. And it came into the clearing. And it came to that pine tree. And as it went by the pine tree, it went. It couldn't figure out where the woman went. Her scent just disappeared. And so it leaned against the pine tree going, "Oh." Meanwhile, up in the tree, the woman was holding on for dear life. But the baby, who was just a baby, the baby reached out its tiny arm and touched a little tiny pine cone. And the pine cone broke off and fell. It saw the woman up there. At first it thought it was maybe a porcupine that had gotten it with quills, but it saw the woman and went, and it grabbed the tree, and the flying head began to shake the tree back and forth, and that poor woman was holding on, and the tree shook back and forth, and as the flying head went up above it, there was a big, thick branch that had died. And as it shook the tree, that branch went creak, creak, crack, and came falling down right on top of the flying head, hitting it to the ground. And it went, the woman quickly climbed down. She ran past the flying head and ran to her village. And the flying head was furious. It couldn't believe she had tricked it. And the woman got to her village just as the sun went down, and she was so tired and exhausted from running all day. She finally got to her longhouse, her lodge. She went inside, took the baby off on the cradle board, and the baby was sound asleep. She put the baby to bed, but she was so hungry. She wanted something quickly, and she noticed that the fire, the red embers of the fire were still hot and smoking. She stirred up the embers with a stick, and she got some chestnuts and put them in the fire to warm up. You ever heard of that song, Chestnuts Roasting on an Open Fire? People eat chestnuts. And so she sat there waiting for those chestnuts to cook. Meanwhile, the flying head had gotten that branch off itself, and now, it was crazy with anger. It didn't care about food. It was going to get that woman. And it went, and went flying through the forest like a tornado. The trees and limbs around it just swirling off. And it came to the village, and every villager went, flying head, and they ran into their houses. And it left them all alone. They couldn't believe it. The flying head ignored them. It just kept flying around the village going. As it flew above the longhouses, it went over one longhouse, and it looked down the smoke hole, and it went. It saw that woman sitting around the fire, and it was about to fly down that smoke hole, grab her, and eat her down, eat her up. But as it was about to fly down the smoke hole, she did something really weird. As it watched that woman, she reached into the fire, grabbed something, tossed it from hand to hand, and then right in her mouth, and ate it. And the flying head went, fire is good to eat. And so the flying head flew down through the smoke hole. The woman leapt back, and the flying head went to that fire pit, and it just started taking big hands of red hot embers, putting it in its mouth. Flames were coming out of its mouth, and it went screaming up through the smoke hole. Smoke was coming out of its ears.
and it flew above the whole village like a comet. And the flying head, it was never seen again. And the villagers came to that woman and they said, nobody has ever defeated a flying head, and somehow you did this. We don't know how, but thank you. And she wouldn't say anything, for she knew that it wasn't her. It was the flying head that took care of itself. But from that day on, whatever that woman's name was, everybody forgot. From that day forward, when they saw her, they just said, "Ah, there's Brave One." And that's the story of Brave Woman and the Flying Head. Thank you very much. Kids, I want to thank all of you. I appreciate every single one of you. You are all a very special being, and I'm really glad you showed up on planet Earth. Thank you. Peace to you all.
Now, a round of applause, regular round of applause. Thank you, Mr. Edmond, for coming. And it's a wonderful storytelling. So, boys and girls, there are some of you that are in PE. I'm going to let you go first because you have PE teachers here and you have a lesson waiting for you. So, Mr. Mariani, Mrs. Wall, and Mrs. Kraft's classroom, please exit out the back. Your PE teachers are waiting. Right to your teachers. They will tell you where to line up and exit. Thank you very much, teachers.
Well, actually, I know she's Australian Canadian. So,
Story about a Lincoln Carter. Jumping jacks on somebody else. Look up now. Get down, dude, what?
great.
Those are horrible. Yeah, I know that. I know that. Big girl pushing. Okay, what are doing?
It's actually great. That's because her father
Girls. What? Stop being set up.
We're putting this way.
Thank you, kids.
You guys are looking good for us.
Very special place. I probably have met him, but I don't know. Because I've actually so probably have met him. I have met the grandson of
See, I just got to remember the stories. Thank you, guys. Peace to you. You have a great day. Pardon? Actually, I've got to do it because, you know, you put your whole life in a 10 by 10 space, and then you're moving somewhere. You actually have to take it down there and spoil it. When you're moving across country, you're like, so I've been in the midst of emptying my 10 by 10 space and just trying to give everything away, which is kind of cool. I gave tons of savers. Savers, it's a great store. Savers is in Henry, near the movie theater. Actually, right next to that. And it's right. It's gorgeous. And it's like volunteers. I gotta say, I like this one. I wanted to ask you. So, how did you end up with that name?
Well, so my parents would, you know, way back then, they, you know, we didn't know whether they were a boy or a girl back then, and they wanted a Joseph. They were convinced my father's father, he died when my father was young, and so they were going to have Joseph, and they were just convinced I was a boy, and I was going to be Joseph, and they just gave a record. What was my name? It was such a conviction. And when it turned out to be a girl, they literally could not, they were frustrated.
They couldn't wrap their